Moving on to the appendicular skeleton. Starting with the bones of the upper limb. First, we're looking at the pectoral girdle that would be forming the shoulder. Looking on here. First bone that shares in the pectoral girdle is going to be the clavicle or the collar bone. And second bone that shares in the formation here of the shoulder is going to be the scapula or the shoulder blade. So we've got two main bones on here that we're looking at. We've got the clavicle, we've got the scapula. If we're looking at the clavicle, clavicle has two ends. One bulging end on here that articulates with this part of the sternum. Can you remind me, what did we call this part of the sternum? What do we call this part of the sternum on here? The manubrium. Manubrium. So the clavicle on here, this is the bones that you can feel here. This is in the front, the scapula in the back, yes. And the clavicle is articulating with the central bone of your chest. This is called the scapula. I'm sorry, this is going to be the sternum. Clavicle is articulating with what part of the sternum? It's my manubrium sterni, or the manubrium of the sternum. So this end of the clavicle, is called either the sternal end. Sternal, why? Because it articulates with the sternum. And another name for it, it's going to be the medial end. So either use sternal end or medial end. Why is it medial? Can you remind me what's medial and what's lateral? Medial means it's directed towards the midline. Towards the midline. It's going towards the midline. So if I'm describing this side of the bone, it's going to be medial. It's going towards the midline. Compared to this flattened end of the clavicle. This flattened end of the clavicle. It shares in the formation of the shoulder. If you hold your shoulder, you'll feel that it's formed of two bones. A process coming from behind, from the shoulder blade, and the continuation of the clavicle. Those are the two bones that will be forming your shoulder. So the process here, coming from the scapula, is sharing in the formation of the shoulder. So what do you call something related to the shoulder back from our very first chapter this semester? Acromial. So we're gonna call this process coming from the scapula. This process on here is my acromial process or acromion. And can you guess, what do you think we're gonna name the end of the clavicle that will be sharing in the formation of the shoulder? What do you think we're going to call the end of the clavicle that shares in the formation of the shoulder? If the end that was articulating with the sternum, we called it a sternal end. What do you think we're going to call the end of the clavicle that shares in the formation of the shoulder? It's going to be my acromial end. And is this going to be directed towards the midline? Is it closer to the midline, or is it located far away from the midline? Is it close to the midline or away from the midline? Clavicle, you see on here, this is my midline. This end of the clavicle is far from the midline compared to this end. So this end is medial end. The other name for it, this end here, the acromial end, is also called the lateral end. All right, so again, what are we looking at in here? We're looking at the collar. Distal means away from the point of origin. Distal means away from the point of origin. Lateral means away from the midline. All right, so again, what we should know here for this bone, the clavicle, we need to know that the clavicle shares with the scapula to form your pectoral or shoulder girdle. The clavicle articulates with the manubrium of the sternum, and the end of the clavicle that articulates with the sternum is what we call the sternal end. Sternal end. Another name for this end, because it's directed towards the midline, it's the medial end. You see here the flattened part of the clavicle. It's directed away from the midline, not towards the midline. So it's going to be the lateral end. And at the same time, it shares in the formation of the shoulder along with the crosses coming from the clavicle. And remember, something related to the shoulder is called acromial. So we're going to call this end is my acromial end or lateral end. So how we're going to be checking out the question on here in the bone, the same exact way like what we did with the axial skeleton. Same exact way like what we did with the axial skeleton. Remember the axial skeleton, we did have three main types of questions, either to identify the bone, identify the bone marking, and another was to state the function or articulation of the bone. So what are all possible questions you can be asked in here, in this bone? So just to give you an impression about how questions can be addressed. So again, when you study, make sure you know the information, not relying that you can guess the answer from the choices. Make sure that you can actually state it, write it down without the need of having choices. So first possible question here is going to be our first question for the in-class activity for today. For number 1, identify the bone. For number 2, and 3. This marking is for 2 and 3. Question number 2, identify the bone marking. For number 3, what is the bone or structure articulating with 2? Number 4, what is the bone articulating with 2? So again, this is 1. This is number 2. And questions 3, 4 are addressing the same marking, which is number 2. Number 5 on here. Identifies the marking. 6, I'm asking what is the bone structure articulating with 5? 7, what is the bones that is articulating with 5? All right, so 7 questions on here. 7 questions, 3 markings. Questions 6 and 7 are addressing the same marking here, number 5. So I don't have to put number 3 and 4 on the diagram, or 5 and or 6 and 7. All right, because I'm asking about the same marking as 2 and 5. All right, so what do you think? What is this bone? Identify the bone. Clever. What is the bone marking? Number 2. Sternal end. Sternal end, or another name for it, it's medial end. What is the bone structure articulating with two? What is the bone structure that articulates with two? The manubrium of the sternum. What is the bone articulating with two? What's the name of the whole bone? Sternum. You see the difference on here? What is the bone structure articulating with two? You mentioned manubrium. You mentioned the specific part. And when I'm asking about the name of a bone, don't forget to mention the name of the whole bone. All right. Number 5, what is bone marking? What is this bone marking? Number 5. Acromial end. And what is the bone structure articulating with 5? A criminal end. All right. No, that's okay. It's a good way to remember it. A criminal end, but rather than I-O. All right. Acromial. Close enough. All right. So, what is the bone structure articulating with 5? What is the bone structure articulating with 5? Structure, you remember the spine here. What do we call the spine? It's my acromion. And what is the whole bone? What is the name of the whole bone that articulates with 5? Can you remind me what do we call this whole bone that articulates with 5? The scapula. Right? Easy, easy. Those are all the possible questions that you can have for the clavicle. Those are all possible questions. Those are all the possible questions that you can have here addressing the clavicle. Right? You only have 2 markings, and those are all possible questions that you can have. Anything seems complicated? Anything seems complicated? All right, so we can have a break for 10. We come back, start our discussion of the scapula and the rest of the appendicular bones. Any questions before we go for a break? Yes, you need to pay attention to the question. You need to read the question and answer exactly what is the question is asking about. All right. Number 6 on here, what is the bone structure articulating with 5? And 5 was the acromial end. So it was the acromion. So you see on here, acromion is this bony process